The sky over Geneva turned green at exactly 6 in the morning, and that is how I knew our world had already ended and a new one had begun. My name is Ethan Hall. Before that morning I was a junior analyst at a defense office nobody outside the building could name. After that morning I was something else, something I did not have a word for yet. None of us did. The ships did not look like ships, they looked like broken moons, dark and heavy, hanging in rows above every capital city on Earth at the same instant. There was no landing. There was no negotiation. There was only a voice, calm and flat, speaking every language on the planet at once, as if it had studied us for 1,000 years and found nothing worth respecting. The voice called itself the Thulren Dominion. It said we had two choices. So we could accept the collar, a small device that would sit at the base of every human neck and quietly take away our will, turning us into obedient labor for an empire that stretched across more stars than anyone could count. Or we could refuse and be removed, the way you might remove an insect from a clean floor. I remember sitting in a windowless briefing room with 11 other people, watching a live feed of the first collar test on a large screen. The subject was a soldier named Marcus Feld, a volunteer, though volunteer is a strange word for a man who was told his country needed him to be first. The collar was placed on his neck by a machine arm lowered from a small drone. It clicked shut. For 4 seconds, Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes empty, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Then his jaw tightened. His eyes came back into focus. He reached up, slow and shaking, and pulled the collar off his own neck and threw it across the room. Nobody in that briefing room breathed for a long moment. On the screen, a Thulren officer's calm voice cut through the silence in the test chamber, saying only one word, repeated twice, like a stuck record. Anomaly, anomaly. I did not understand yet what that flicker meant. None of us did, not fully, not that first day. But I remember writing one line in my notebook because it felt important even though I could not explain why. The collar failed. Something about us does not break the way they expected. Word of the failed test moved through the emergency government channels faster than any official statement could keep up with. By noon, every major broadcaster on the planet had the footage, blurred and grainy, smuggled out through channels nobody wanted to admit existed. People did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. A single soldier resisting a device for 4 extra seconds was not victory. But it was a crack, and cracks are how you know something is not as solid as it claims to be. I spent that first day the way I imagine most people did, glued to a screen, waiting for someone in charge to explain what came next. The world's governments, who had spent decades arguing over trade routes and borders, suddenly found themselves on the same emergency call, translated in real time, voices overlapping in fear. I was not in that room. I was 3 floors below it, running numbers on Thulren's ship movement, trying to find a pattern in something that felt like it had no pattern at all. My supervisor was a woman named Grace Ellery, sharp-eyed, quiet, the kind of person who had clearly expected disaster her whole career and was almost, in some small tired way, unsurprised that it had finally arrived. She leaned over my desk that first evening and asked me what I saw in the data. I told her the truth. I did not see a war plan. I saw an inspection. The Thulren ships were not positioned to strike first. They were positioned to watch, to record, to wait for compliance. Grace nodded slowly and said the words that stuck with me through everything that followed. They think this is already over. That was the shape of the enemy we were dealing with, though we did not have the full picture yet. The Thulren Dominion had done this before, more times than any human number could comfortably hold. Species after species, world after world, greeted with the same offer, the same collar, the same quiet certainty that resistance was not a real possibility, only a formality to be processed before the real work of conquest began. They had never lost. Not once, not anywhere, not against anyone. I did not know that yet, not with real weight behind it. I only knew what I saw in the data, and what I saw was strange. Their fleet was enormous compared to anything humanity had ever built, yes, but it was arranged like a parade. not like a battle line. There were no reserves held back. There was no defensive posture at all. It was the formation of something certain it would never need to defend itself. The deadline the Thulren gave us was 7 days. 7 days for the entire planet to accept the collar, region by region, city by city, or face what their voice called correction. I remember how strange that word sounded, how clinical, how it tried so hard to avoid saying what it actually meant. Over those first 2 days, I watched the world try, in its clumsy and frightened way, to find a version of unity it had never managed before. Nations that had not spoken to each other in years were suddenly sharing satellite data. Old rivalries did not disappear, but they went quiet, pushed aside by something bigger than any of them. I sat in more meetings in those 48 hours than I had in the previous 4 years of my career, watching men and women who commanded armies and economies try to speak carefully to each other for possibly the first time in their lives. There was no single leader chosen for humanity, no dramatic figure standing at a podium the way old films might have shown. Instead, there was a patchwork, a council formed in a hurry, made of people who mostly hated the idea of sharing power, but hated the alternative more. I only had a small seat at the edge of that world, feeding numbers upward, but I could feel the tension in every hallway, every phone call, every silence that stretched half a second too long before someone spoke. On the 3rd day, something happened that I still think about more than almost anything else from that week. A message came through, not from the Thulren, but from another species entirely, broadcast on the same frequency the Dominion had used to reach us. It was garbled, half destroyed, clearly not meant to survive the trip, but our systems captured enough of it to translate a fragment. It said, as best our translators could piece together, that resistance had been tried before, by others, and it had never worked, not against them. It was not encouragement, it was a warning, tired and worn thin by repetition, from some other conquered world trying, in its last free moment, to spare us the same fate. I remember Grace reading that translated fragment out loud in a quiet voice, and nobody in the room said anything for a long time afterward. It would have been easy, so easy, to let that message break something in us. Instead, oddly, it did the opposite. It gave the fear a shape, and shapes can be studied, and studied things can eventually be understood. By the 4th day, the collars had been distributed to several regional testing sites, always with volunteers, always monitored closely by Thulren observers who did not seem to expect any results other than success. And each time, in ways small and large, the same strange pattern repeated. Some people accepted the collar and fell into total obedience, exactly as advertised, their eyes hollow, their voices flat, but a portion, not all, but enough to matter, resisted in some way. Some pulled the collar off within minutes, some fought through the fog long enough to speak a single clear sentence before falling silent again. It was never total, it was never predictable, but it was there, and it seemed to trouble the Thulren more than they wanted to show. I began to understand, slowly, sitting with the data late into those nights, that the Thulren had built their entire history of conquest on a single assumption, that every mind, given the right pressure in the right place, would fold the same way. They had tested this assumption on hundreds of worlds, and it had never failed them. And now, for the first time in longer than any of us could guess, it was failing, not completely, but enough to be noticed, enough to be feared. On the 5th day, I was called into a meeting I had no business being in, only because Grace insisted I present the resistance data myself instead of through a summary. The room was full of people with far more authority than me, tired faces lit by cold light, listening to a 26-year-old analyst explain that humanity's strange, uneven, unpredictable stubbornness might be the only weapon we had. I remember one of the older officials, a woman with silver hair and a voice like gravel, asking me directly whether this resistance meant we could win. I did not have a good answer. I told her the truth instead. I said I did not know if it meant we could win, but I knew it meant they were wrong about us. And being wrong about your enemy is the first mistake that ever loses a war. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once, and the meeting moved on to logistics I barely understood. But I remember that moment clearly, because it was the first time I said something out loud that I would end up believing completely, all the way to the end of everything that followed. By the 6th day, the world had not accepted the caller. Not fully, not anywhere, despite the Thulren's clear expectation that we would. Every region reported the same story. Quiet refusal spreading faster than any government could organize, faster than any fear could smother it. People simply would not put the devices on. Some out of courage, some out of stubbornness, some simply because their neighbor had refused first. And shame is a powerful thing among humans. I stood on the roof of our building that night, off duty for the first time in days, and looked up at the dark shape hanging in the sky above the city, blotting out a patch of stars that should have been there. It did not look like a warning anymore. It looked like a countdown. Grace joined me up there, saying nothing for a while, just looking up at the same shape I was looking at. Then she said quietly that the Thulren voice had gone silent for 6 hours, longer than any silence since first contact. She said that in her experience, silence from an enemy that expects easy victory usually means one of two things. Either they are celebrating, or they are recalculating. I did not know which one it was. Nobody did, not yet. But standing there under that broken moon, I understood something for the first time, something that would carry me through everything that came after. The Thulren Dominion had built an empire on the certainty that no species could refuse them twice. They had never met a species that refused them from the very first hour, in ways too many and too strange to fully collar, and kept refusing, quietly and completely, right up until the deadline ran out. On the 7th day, the deadline arrived, and the sky above every major city on Earth went silent and still, waiting for an answer that had already been given 1,000 small times over, in 1,000 small refusals, long before any official word was ever spoken. We had said no, not with one voice, not with one leader, not even with full agreement among ourselves, but we had said it, again and again, in enough places that it could not be ignored. And somewhere above us, in ships shaped like broken moons, something that had never once needed to prepare for war was finally, for the first time in its long and unbroken history, forced to consider that it might have made a mistake. The silence lasted 3 more days after the deadline passed, and those 3 days taught me more about fear than anything that came before or after. I want to explain why the callers failed, because understanding that failure became the center of everything humanity did next. The Thulren had used the same device, in some form or another, on every species they had ever conquered. It worked by finding the strongest pathway of instinct in a mind, usually something built around a shared survival fear, and pressing on it until the whole mind gave way and followed orders without question. On most worlds, that pathway was consistent enough that one design of collar could be mass-produced and used everywhere with almost no failure. Human minds did not have one consistent pathway. We learned this slowly, through careful study by our own scientists working with captured data and smuggled fragments of Thulren research that a few brave technical teams had managed to pull from damaged equipment left behind after failed tests. Every human brain seemed to route its fear and its will through a slightly different path, shaped by memory, by upbringing, by stubborn personal history that no outside device could fully predict. The collar was built to break one kind of mind. It met millions of different kinds instead, all of them related but none of them quite the same, and it simply did not have enough patterns stored to handle that many exceptions. A scientist named Nina Voss, who I would come to know well over the following months, explained it to me once, in a phrase I never forgot. She said humanity was not stronger than every other species the Thulren had conquered. We were just less predictable, and less predictable things are much harder to control than strong things, because control depends on knowing exactly what will happen next. I think about that phrase often, less predictable. It sounds almost like a small thing, almost like a shrug, but it turned out to be the crack that split an empire. During those 3 silent days, I was moved from my analyst desk into a much larger operation, something that had been quietly building in the background for years, without most of us knowing it existed. It was called, in the dry language of government projects, the Continuity Directive, though everyone who worked there just called it the basement, since half of it really was buried far underground. It held decades of shelved weapons research, propulsion designs judged too dangerous or too expensive to build in peacetime, energy systems abandoned halfway through testing because nobody could justify the cost when there was no enemy to justify it against. Now there was an enemy, and cost had stopped being the question that mattered. I was assigned to a small team led by a systems engineer named Derek Coyle, a blunt, restless man who had spent 15 years designing weapons nobody thought would ever be used, and who now moved through the basement like a man who had been vindicated in the worst possible way. Our first task was simple to describe and almost impossible to do. Take whatever we could learn about Thulren technology from failed collar units and damaged Thulren equipment, and use it to accelerate every shelved human project sitting in storage. It should have taken years. We did not have years. Derek liked to say, more than once during those early weeks, that desperation was the fastest engineer in the world because it did not care about budgets or careers or comfortable timelines. It only cared about not dying. On the fourth day after the deadline, the silence ended. The Thulren voice returned, but it had changed. It was no longer calm. It still tried to sound calm, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something closer to frustration than any machine intelligence should have been capable of showing. It announced that human compliance had fallen far below acceptable levels and that a correction would be applied to demonstrate the seriousness of the offer. I remember exactly where I was when the correction happened. I was in the basement, 3 levels underground, reviewing propulsion data with Derek and Nina, when every screen in the room switched at once to an emergency broadcast. A city, one that many of us knew, one that had families and streets and small ordinary lives inside it, was struck from orbit. Not with a weapon designed to conquer, with a weapon designed only to erase. I will not describe what the broadcast showed. I do not think it needs describing, and I do not think dwelling on it honors anyone who was there. What I will say is that the room went completely silent, and stayed silent for a long time, and when people finally began speaking again, their voices had changed in a way that never fully changed back. Derek was the first to speak in our room. He said, in a low and steady voice that did not match the anger I could see in his eyes, that we were done pretending this could be solved with patience. Nina did not argue. Nobody argued. I think that single moment did more to unite humanity than every summit and every council meeting combined. Governments that had spent days arguing over resource allocation suddenly stopped arguing. Regions that had hesitated to fully commit their military forces to a shared command suddenly committed everything without further debate. It was not a decision made calmly. It was a decision made the way a hand pulls back from fire, immediate and total, and beyond argument. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched the basement transform from a slow research project into something closer to a controlled explosion of effort. Teams that used to work in isolation, protecting their own projects out of habit and old rivalry, began sharing everything, freely, without hesitation, because the old reasons for secrecy simply stopped mattering. Derek's propulsion team merged with a materials group that had spent a decade trying to strengthen hull plating using principles found in fragments of Thulren wreckage. Nina's understanding of the collar's failure fed directly into new communication research, because if the Thulren struggled to predict human minds through a device meant for control, it stood to reason they might also struggle to fully predict human intentions through their own surveillance systems. That idea became one of the most important early breakthroughs. A small team led by a communications specialist named Claire Doran managed to intercept and partially decode fragments of Thulren fleet communication, not because our technology matched theirs, but because their systems had never been designed with human unpredictability in mind. They filtered their own data through assumptions about obedient, easily modeled minds. Human interference did not fit their expected patterns cleanly, and small gaps opened in their filters, gaps just wide enough for careful analysis to slip through. I spent long nights in those weeks working alongside Claire, turning fragments of decoded signal into something resembling a map of Thulren fleet movement. It was slow, painstaking work, full of dead ends and false patterns, but slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to form. The Tholran fleet above Earth was large, far larger than anything we could match ship for ship, but it was not infinite, and it was not perfectly coordinated. It relied heavily on a central command structure, a handful of key vessels that directed everything else. If those vessels could be identified and isolated, the rest of the fleet would be forced to operate independently, slower, less certain, more prone to the same kind of mistakes any large organization makes when its center of command goes quiet. I remember the day Claire found the first confirmed location of one of those central command vessels. She called it in a hushed voice across the room, careful, as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert the ship itself. Derek came over immediately, and the three of us stood around a screen showing a rough outline of a Tholran vessel far larger and more heavily defended than any of the others in the fleet. It felt, for the first time since the sky turned green over Geneva, like we were looking at something instead of only reacting to it. Around this same time, I began to understand something about the shift happening in ordinary people across the planet, not just in labs and command centers, but in homes and streets and small communities everywhere. Fear had not disappeared. Grief certainly had not disappeared, not after the correction, not after everything that followed it, but something else had grown alongside those feelings, something quieter and harder to name, a kind of steady, grim resolve, the sort that does not shout or celebrate, but simply keeps working, day after day, without needing to be told twice. I saw it in the volunteers who lined up outside recruitment stations, more of them than any single conflict in history had ever drawn. I saw it in factory workers who abandoned peacetime production lines overnight and began building armor plating and power cells instead, working double shifts without complaint. I saw it in Grace, my old supervisor, who now ran a full division of the growing war effort and still found time, somehow, to check on the well-being of everyone under her command, even in the middle of impossible workloads. I want to be honest that not everything went smoothly during those weeks. There were disagreements, sometimes sharp ones, about how far humanity should be willing to go in response to the correction. Some argued for caution, for finding some diplomatic path, even after everything that had happened, worried about what total war might cost us in the long run, worried about what it might turn us into. Others argued that caution was a luxury we no longer had, that an enemy willing to erase a city without hesitation would not respect restraint, only strength. I did not have a strong opinion at the time, not really, not the way some of the people around me did. I was young and tired, and mostly focused on the narrow slice of the problem in front of me. But I remember a conversation with Nina late one night, when the basement was quiet except for the hum of machines, where she said something that stayed with me through everything that followed. She said that the Tholran had built an empire believing that fear alone could end a species' will to resist, and that if humanity answered fear with fear, we would only prove them right. But if we answered fear with steady, careful, relentless work, the kind that does not need applause to keep going, we would prove something else entirely, something they had never had to account for in any of their long, unbroken history of conquest. I did not fully understand what she meant that night. I understood it much better later, watching what humanity slowly became over the following months, not through speeches or declarations, but through the simple accumulation of small, stubborn choices made by millions of ordinary people who refused to stop. By the end of those first weeks after the correction, the picture had changed completely from where we started. We were no longer a frightened planet waiting for an ultimatum to expire. We were a planet quietly, methodically, and almost silently preparing for a war we intended to win, built not on one great weapon or one brilliant leader, but on thousands of small teams like ours, working without rest, refusing in 1,000 different quiet ways to accept the ending that had been offered to us. The Tholran had expected obedience within 7 days. Instead, they had given humanity something far more dangerous than any weapon in our old shelved research. They had given us a reason, clear and permanent, to never stop building. The first time I saw a Tholran ship break apart in the sky, I did not cheer. I stood very still and watched it happen, and I remember feeling something close to grief mixed with relief, because I understood in that moment that there was no path back to the world we had before the ships arrived. That moment came about 6 weeks after the correction, and it came from a plan built almost entirely on patience, on the slow accumulation of small advantages that Claire, Derek, Nina, and dozens of teams like ours had gathered without ever being sure it would be enough. The plan targeted one of the central command vessels Claire had identified, a ship the Tholran called, in their own intercepted communications, a coordination hub. It did not fight directly. It organized the fighting of everything around it, relaying orders, adjusting formations, keeping the rest of the fleet moving as one single mind instead of many separate parts. Our own forces, gathered under a joint command that had formed in those weeks with surprising speed, given how reluctant nations usually were to share control of anything, launched a coordinated strike using 3 different approaches at once. Newly modified interceptors, built from Derek's accelerated propulsion research, moved in fast and low, using patterns of movement that Nina's team had designed specifically to avoid matching any behavior the Tholran targeting systems expected. At the same time, Claire's decoding work let us feed false coordinates into a narrow part of the enemy's communication network, just enough confusion to slow their response by a handful of critical seconds. And underneath all of that, a small group of specially adapted vessels carrying weapons pulled straight from the old shelved research in the basement closed in on the coordination hub itself. I watched the whole operation from a secure command room, alongside Grace and several others, on a bank of screens that showed data streams instead of any dramatic visual, mostly just lines and numbers moving across dark backgrounds. It did not look like the battles from old films. It looked more like watching several people solve a difficult puzzle at the same time, racing against an opponent who did not yet realize the puzzle had begun. The coordination hub's shields held for longer than our models predicted, and for a moment I thought the whole operation might fail, might become another lesson we would have to absorb and rebuild from. Then, all at once, the numbers on the screen shifted, and Grace, standing beside me, said quietly that the hub's defensive pattern had just changed in a way that suggested confusion rather than calculation. Claire's interference had worked. The ship was reacting to threats that were not fully real, spreading its defenses thin, trying to answer questions that did not have true answers. That confusion was enough. The specially adapted vessels closed the final distance and struck the coordination hub directly. I watched the shape on the screen fragment into smaller shapes, then smaller still, until what had been one massive vessel became a scattering of debris tumbling slowly against the dark backdrop of space. The room did not erupt into celebration the way I might have expected. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence, the kind that comes after holding your breath for far too long. Then, quietly, someone near the back of the room began to clap, just once, just a single sound, and it spread through the room slowly, not loud, not triumphant, just steady and tired and real. I remember Grace turning to me and saying only one sentence, "Now they know we can hit back." That sentence carried more weight than any speech could have managed, because it was true in a way that changed everything that followed. Losing the coordination hub had an effect on the rest of the Tholran fleet that our analysts had predicted but had not fully believed until they saw it happen. Ships that had been moving with calm, coordinated precision suddenly grew hesitant, adjusting their patterns in ways that suggested they no longer had clear direction from above. It did not make them weak, it made them slower, and slower was enough of an opening for us to keep pressing. Over the following weeks, our joint command grew far more confident, though never careless. I moved out of the basement more often during this period, sent to observation posts and forward command stations to help interpret data directly from the field instead of only from behind a desk. It was during one of these postings that I met a soldier named Adam Reyes, a calm, steady man who had been among the very first to be tested with a collar back on that first terrible day, and who now led a small unit specializing in disabling Tholran ground installations that had been quietly established on Earth to monitor compliance. Adam told me once, during a quiet moment between operations, that he did not remember much from the moment the collar was placed on him. Only a strange pressure, like being pushed down underwater, and then a sudden clear thought rising up through that pressure, simple and stubborn, refusing to let go. He said the thought had not been anything grand or heroic. It had simply been the memory of his younger sister's voice, calling his name the way she used to when they were children. He said he still did not fully understand why that memory was strong enough to break through when so much else had failed, but he was grateful for it every single day since. Stories like Adam's became common across the growing resistance, though nobody organized them or advertised them. They spread through soldiers and workers and ordinary families the way stories always spread, quietly, person to person, gathering small details each time they were retold. A grandmother in one region who had resisted collar testing by focusing entirely on an old song she used to sing to her grandchildren. A young worker in another region who resisted by silently counting numbers over and over, refusing to let his mind go quiet even under pressure. None of these stories were dramatic in the way old war stories often are. They were small, personal, deeply human, and together they built something larger than any single act of resistance could have built alone. I began to understand, during this period, that humanity's greatest advantage was never going to be raw power, not against an empire with technology so far beyond our own. Our advantage was this constant, quiet refusal to be simplified into one predictable shape, and every soldier, every worker, every stubborn small memory that helped someone resist in their own personal way, added another thread to something the Thulren could not fully map or fully control. Not every part of that period went well, and I do not want to give the impression that our progress came without cost. There were operations that failed, teams that did not come back, families across the world who lost people during those long weeks of careful, grinding effort. I attended more than one quiet memorial gathering during that time, standing beside people I had come to respect deeply, watching them carry grief alongside their determination, without letting either one fully replace the other. I remember one particular loss that affected our team directly. A member of Claire's communications group, a careful, quiet woman named Elena Marsh, was lost during an operation meant to expand our decoding network closer to Thulren territory in orbit. She had volunteered for the mission herself, understanding the risk clearly, because she believed the information gathered could save far more lives than her own single contribution risked. Claire did not speak for almost a full day after we received the news, and when she finally did speak again, it was to quietly finish the very research Elena had been working on, finishing it exactly the way Elena would have wanted, careful and precise and complete. I think about Elena often, though I never knew her well personally. I think about how ordinary her choice must have felt to her in the moment, simply doing the next necessary thing, and how extraordinary that same choice looked from the outside, looking back. That, more than anything else, became the pattern of the entire resistance during this stage of the war. Ordinary choices, made by ordinary people, adding up slowly into something the Thulren simply could not account for in their models of conquest. By the end of this stage, our joint command had grown confident enough to begin planning operations beyond simple defense. We were no longer only protecting cities and disabling local installations. We were beginning to imagine, carefully and cautiously at first, what it might look like to take the fight further, beyond Earth's own orbit, into the wider Thulren presence that our growing intelligence network had slowly begun to map. I remember sitting in a planning session with Grace, Derek, Nina, Claire, and Adam all present for the first time in one room, each of them representing a different piece of what our resistance had become. Grace laid out a simple question on the table, the same question that had guided everything since the correction, phrased now with a new weight behind it. Not whether we could survive the Thulren dominion any longer. That question had already been answered, slowly, through weeks of stubborn effort. The new question was simpler and far more serious. How far were we willing to go to make sure this never happened to us again? Nobody answered right away. I remember the quiet in that room, each of us carrying our own private version of everything we had seen and lost so far. Then Adam, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, spoke first. his voice steady in the way I had come to expect from him. He said we had already answered that question the moment we refused the collar in the very first hour, before any of us understood what refusing would cost. Everything since then had simply been learning how to make that first refusal permanent. Grace nodded slowly, and the meeting moved forward from there, no longer discussing whether to continue, only how. I left that room understanding that the careful, quiet resistance of the past weeks was about to become something larger, something with a clear direction and a clear purpose, aimed not just at survival, but at making absolutely certain that survival would never again depend on anyone else's mercy. The offensive began quietly, the way most important things in this war had begun, without grand announcements, without speeches, only careful preparation followed by sudden, decisive action. Our joint command had spent weeks mapping the wider Tholran presence beyond Earth, using every fragment of decoded communication Claire's team could gather, combined with careful observation from newly built long-range sensors that Derek's engineering teams had rushed into production. What we found confirmed something our early analysis had suggested from the very beginning. Earth was not the center of Tholran power. It was a distant post in a much larger empire, one small conquest among hundreds, expected to fall quickly and quietly the way every other world had fallen before it. That distance, which had once felt like an overwhelming disadvantage, slowly began to look like an opportunity. The Tholran had not sent their entire empire to conquer us. They had sent what they believed was more than enough, based on their long, unbroken history of easy victories. If Earth's resistance had already stretched what they considered more than enough, then the wider empire behind it might be far less prepared for sustained conflict than its size alone would suggest. I remember Nina presenting this idea during a full command briefing, laying out data patiently, careful not to overstate what we did not yet know for certain. She said that empires built on fear rather than loyalty tend to be strong on the surface and brittle underneath, because fear only holds while it feels absolute. The moment fear cracks in one place, even a small place, it tends to crack faster everywhere else, because the people living under that fear start to believe, for the first time, that another outcome might be possible. Our first move beyond Earth's own orbit targeted a supply route, a quiet corridor of space the Tholran used to move resources and reinforcements toward our system without needing to pass through heavily defended territory. Disrupting that route would not defeat the Tholran on its own, but it would force them to divert attention and resources away from Earth, buying our recovering world more time to grow stronger. I was present for that operation, not on the front line, but close enough in the command structure to feel its full weight as it unfolded. Adam led a small strike team directly, using tactics built from months of studying how the Tholran responded to unpredictable human behavior. Claire's team fed careful misdirection into their communication network again, though by this point the Tholran had grown more cautious, having learned, slowly and painfully, that human interference could not simply be ignored. The operation succeeded, though not without cost, and not without difficulty. I remember the tension in the command room stretching for hours, watching reports come in piece by piece, each one uncertain until confirmed. When the supply route was finally disrupted, cutting off a significant portion of reinforcements heading toward our system, the room did not erupt into celebration the way it might have during earlier, smaller victories. Instead, there was a quiet, focused determination, the kind that comes from people who understand there is still a very long road ahead. Over the following months, this pattern repeated again and again, growing steadily in scale and ambition. Supply routes disrupted, isolated outposts disabled, small Tholran holdings, worlds and stations that had been fully conquered decades or centuries earlier, suddenly found themselves cut off from the Empire's central authority, left uncertain and unsupported for the first time since their own conquest. I want to be honest about something difficult during this stage of the war, because I think it matters more than any single victory. As our offensive grew larger and more successful, I began to notice a change, not just in our tactics, but in the way many of us, myself included, began to think about the war itself. The careful, reluctant resolve of the earlier months slowly hardened into something more absolute. We were no longer simply defending our right to exist. We were actively working to dismantle an empire built on centuries of conquest, and dismantling something that large required decisions that did not always sit comfortably, even when they were necessary. I remember a specific moment that captured this shift clearly. During one operation aimed at a significant Thulran outpost, our forces encountered a small group representing what remained of local Thulran administration, sent forward not to fight, but to negotiate. Their representative, speaking through a translation device, asked for terms, offering information about the wider empire in exchange for the safety of the personnel stationed there. I was not in the room for that negotiation directly, but I heard about it afterward from Grace, who was present as part of the joint command overseeing the operation. She told me that for a long moment, nobody spoke, each person in that room silently weighing memories of the collar, the correction, the city erased without hesitation, against the quiet request now being made for mercy. In the end, the personnel were not harmed, information was accepted, and the outpost was disabled rather than destroyed outright. Grace told me this decision had not come easily, and had been argued over carefully before it was made. She said the hardest part of the entire war, harder in some ways than any single battle, was deciding again and again where the line should sit between necessary strength and something we would not be able to live with afterward. I think about that conversation often, because I believe it reveals something important about what allowed humanity to succeed, where so many other species apparently had not. We were capable of enormous, sustained determination, even ruthlessness, when survival demanded it, but we never fully stopped asking the harder question underneath every difficult decision. Not simply what would win, but what we could still recognize ourselves as, once the fighting was finally over. That question did not slow us down. Not really, not when it mattered most. As our offensive continued to grow, we moved from disrupting supply routes and isolated outposts towards something far larger, striking directly at regional centers of Thulran power, places where fleets gathered, where resources were processed, where the Empire's presence was strongest outside its own homeworld. I remember the operation against one such regional center clearly, both because of its scale and because of how much it revealed about how far the war had truly come. This was no longer a small strike team using clever misdirection against a single vessel. This was a coordinated assault involving dozens of ships, built from designs that barely resembled the shelved research we had started with months earlier, now refined and multiplied through months of relentless effort by teams like Derek's, working alongside allied engineers who had joined our cause as word of Earth's resistance spread quietly through other conquered systems. That detail matters, and I want to explain it clearly, because it changed the shape of the entire war. Earth's resistance had not gone unnoticed by other worlds living under Thulran control. Slowly, carefully, through channels Claire's team had helped establish, word had spread that one small, distant world had refused the collar, had survived the correction, and was now actively fighting back rather than waiting quietly for its own eventual defeat. Some of those other worlds began, in small, quiet ways at first, to offer help. Information. Old resistance networks long thought defeated, quietly reactivating. Even, eventually, small numbers of volunteers willing to fight alongside us, drawn by nothing more than the simple fact that someone, somewhere, had finally said no and made it stick. I remember meeting one of these volunteers directly, a pilot from a world I had never heard of before that meeting, who introduced herself simply as Mira and explained, through a translator, that her own people had accepted the collar generations earlier, believing resistance was hopeless, only to watch quietly from beneath its control as Earth proved otherwise. She said she had traveled a long distance at great personal risk, simply to help make sure that proof was not wasted. Meeting Mira changed something in how I understood the war. It had stopped being only about Earth's survival. It had become, almost without any of us fully deciding it should, a wider unraveling of the fear that had held the entire Thulran Empire together for so long. Every successful operation did not just weaken the Thulran directly. It weakened the story they told every conquered world under their control. The story that resistance was always hopeless, that obedience was always the only reasonable choice. By the time our forces, now strengthened by allies drawn from across dozens of worlds, moved towards striking directly at the Tholran homeworld's outer defenses, I understood that we were no longer simply fighting a war to protect Earth. We were fighting to end the fear itself, the same fear that had opened with a collar placed on a soldier named Marcus Feld, and had spread outward across the galaxy for longer than any single record could fully capture. I stood in the command room during the opening moments of that final assault, watching alongside Grace, Derek, Nina, Claire, Adam, and Mira, each of us carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Grace turned to the room before the operation began and said something simple, something that I believe captured everything the war had become since that first terrible morning. She said we were not fighting to conquer anyone. We were fighting to make absolutely certain that no one, anywhere, would ever again believe that fear was strong enough to hold a species down forever. The assault began moments later, and I watched the opening formations move forward on the screens in front of me, carrying with them not just Earth's own hard-won strength, but the quiet hope of every world that had ever been told resistance was impossible. The final assault on the Tholran homeworld's outer defenses lasted 11 days, though I remember it now as one long stretch of time without clear edges, blurring together through exhaustion and careful, constant attention to details that could not afford to be missed. I want to describe how it ended, but I think it matters more to describe how it felt, because the numbers and formations, important as they were, do not capture what those final days actually meant to the people living through them. The Tholran homeworld's defenses were the strongest we had encountered anywhere in the Empire, built over centuries around the assumption that no threat would ever reach this deep into their territory. For the first several days, progress was slow and costly, and there were moments when even Grace, usually so steady, allowed a flicker of doubt to cross her face during briefings. But slow progress was still progress, and each day brought fresh confirmation of something Nina had said months earlier, back when our entire resistance was still small and uncertain. An empire built on fear grows brittle exactly where it has never needed to defend itself before, because it has never truly practiced defending anything at all. By the 7th day, the outer defenses had been broken through entirely, not by one single decisive strike, but by the accumulated weight of hundreds of smaller efforts working together, human ingenuity combined with the growing support of allies from other worlds, all moving with a coordination that would have been impossible without the months of hard lessons that came before it. I remember speaking with Adam during a brief pause in that period, both of us worn thin from lack of proper rest, standing quietly near a viewport that showed the distant shape of the Tholran homeworld ahead of us. He asked me if I ever thought, back during that very first week, that we would end up here, fighting this deep into enemy territory. I told him honestly that I had not, that back then I had only hoped we might survive long enough to see another year. He nodded slowly, and said that maybe that was the honest truth about most turning points in history. Nobody standing at the beginning of them ever fully believes they will reach the end. By the 9th day, communication from the Tholran Central Authority changed in tone for the final time. The same calm voice that had first offered us the collar, now speaking words that sounded, for the first time in the entire war, uncertain. It offered new terms, different from anything demanded before, terms that suggested withdrawal, suggested boundaries, suggested a version of peace built on something other than complete obedience. I was present in the command room when those terms arrived, and I remember the heavy silence that followed, every person there carrying their own private memory of everything that had led to this moment. Grace read the terms carefully, twice, before speaking. She said that terms offered only after total defeat becomes certain are not really terms at all. They are simply an attempt to preserve just enough power to try again later, quietly, patiently, the way empires like this one always eventually try again. The decision that followed was not made lightly, and I do not want to suggest it was simple or easy for anyone involved, but it was made clearly, And it was made together, drawing on every lesson learned since that first terrible morning when the sky over Geneva turned green. We would not accept partial terms from an empire that had shown no hesitation, offering only total submission or total destruction to us and to countless other worlds before us. If fear was the only language this empire had ever truly respected, then fear would be answered, finally and completely, with the absolute certainty that this particular threat would never rise again. The final 2 days of the assault moved swiftly once that decision was made. I will not describe the details of what unfolded on the Thulren homeworld itself, because I do not believe those details matter as much as their outcome. What matters is that by the 11th day, the empire that had once broadcast its offer of subjugation to every corner of our world with total unquestioned confidence no longer existed as a unified power capable of threatening anyone. I remember standing in the command room during the final confirmed reports, surrounded by the same people who had carried this fight from its earliest, most uncertain days. Grace, quiet and steady as always, though I could see the weight of everything settling behind her eyes. Derek, who had spent so many sleepless nights turning shelved research into the tools that made this moment possible. Nina, whose early insight into human unpredictability had, in many ways, planted the first seed of everything that followed. Claire, who had given so much of herself, including the loss of a friend she never fully stopped carrying with her. Adam, steady through every stage of the war, still calm even now, at its ending. And Mira, from a world I had never heard of before this war, standing quietly among people who had become, in ways none of us could have predicted at the start, something like family. Nobody cheered, not the way old stories about victory often suggest they should. There was relief, certainly, and something close to disbelief, the strange quiet feeling of finally setting down a weight carried for so long it had become part of how we moved through the world. But there was also grief, present in every one of us, for everything and everyone lost along the way, and a quiet awareness that the people we had become through this long fight were not entirely the same people who had once watched, frightened and uncertain, as ships shaped like broken moons first appeared above our cities. In the months that followed, word of what had happened spread across the wider galaxy far faster than any single broadcast could have managed on its own. Other worlds, long conquered, long resigned to quiet obedience, began, in small and cautious ways at first, to test the boundaries of their own captivity. Not every attempt succeeded, and I do not want to suggest that everything simply resolved itself easily once the Thulren fell. Empires that large leave behind complicated, tangled situations that took careful diplomacy, patience, and continued effort to work through, long after the fighting itself had ended. But something fundamental had changed, permanently, in the story that spread from world to world. It was no longer a story about an empire that could never be resisted. It was a story about a small, distant world that had refused, from the very first hour, in ways too many and too strange to ever fully collar, and had kept refusing, patiently and completely, until refusal became victory. I think about that first day often, the green sky over Geneva, the calm voice offering us a simple choice between obedience and destruction, the flicker of resistance in a soldier named Marcus Feld that nobody, including the Thulren themselves, fully understood in that early moment. I think about how small that flicker seemed at the time, 4 extra seconds of resistance against an empire that had never lost, and how it grew, slowly and quietly, through thousands of ordinary choices made by ordinary people, into something large enough to end that empire's long, unbroken history entirely. I do not know exactly what humanity will become in the long years ahead, now that the immediate danger has passed, and the harder work of rebuilding, healing, and understanding what we have been through still lies before us. I know we are not the same as we were before that first morning, and I do not think we ever fully can be again. Some of what we learn to do, in order to survive and eventually to win, is not easy to carry quietly afterward, and I suspect it will take a long time before we fully understand everything that victory cost us. But I also know this, clearly and completely, standing now in the quiet aftermath of everything that happened. Across the wider galaxy, Among worlds that once whispered fearfully about the Thulran Dominion's unbroken power, a new whisper has begun to spread instead, quiet, but unmistakable, passed carefully from one uncertain world to another. I hope, more than almost anything else, that we never do. But if that day ever comes, I believe now, with a certainty I did not have on that first frightened morning, that we will be ready, not because we are the strongest, and not because we are the most powerful, but because we have already shown, once, clearly and completely, that we simply do not know how to stop refusing.